5 cards that flopped in Standard, but broke Wild. Up first, we have the poster child for this entire video, the card that I think fits this category the best. Cataclysm. Cataclysm is an epic warlock spell from the Kobolds and Catacombs set, releasing all the way back in 2017. When printed, it was a 4-mana card that read, destroy all minions, discard your hand. Yes, you had to discard your entire hand in order to clear not only your opponent's board, but also your own board. As you could probably imagine, in any sort of generic control deck where you're like, ooh, 4 mana, full board clear, you'd see that and you'd be interested, but as a result of having to discard your entire hand, the card was a meme card for its entirety of many early years. However, many people excitedly used it with cards such as Malchezaar Imp and, importantly, Lakari Sacrifice, the Warlock Ungoro quest, where your goal was to discard cards, and as a result, your reward would be that you'd open a portal to summon infinite 3/2s. Their goal, by including Cataclysm in this deck, was to make the discard Warlock deck anything superior to utter garbage. But it really was still just a lesser bad meme. But, however, back then, less bad meme decks had enough players and the game was thriving enough that there are likely people out there that had many positive experiences with this deck, and some may even incorrectly assume that it was generically great. But ultimately, Cataclysm, outside of that small pocket, was largely considered a meme, because why would you want to discard your entire hand for a 2-sided AoE when you could play a card like Hellfire or Defile, etc. Eventually, however, the card left Standard, and it sat around in Wild still for many years as an entirely terrible card with a terrible meme, and then suddenly was no longer the big terrible meme it once was. You see, that discarding of the hand downside didn't matter anymore, as it now allowed you to discard your hand whilst clearing your own board, which just so happened to contain Mecha'thun, which as a result would mean that your board was empty and your hand was empty, and you'd assumedly wait until your deck was empty. So now by playing this Cataclysm, you are activating your Mecha'thun Death Rattle and you are winning the game. The only thing you had to do with this deck in the strategy was draw into Fatigue, cheat out the Mecha'thun itself using one of several options, you know, this popular 5-mana 3/6 here being one of them, and then boom, Cataclysm GG. Furthermore, discard mechanic of the Warlock class is a bit of an evergreen mechanic where they print a little bit here, and they print a little bit there, until eventually, in Wild, you have enough discard cards that you start looking at this pamphlet of options like, maybe I could build something with these. This discard of the hand shifted, not from just not hurting anymore, if you manage to cheat all the way to being able to pull off your Lake Mecha'thun combo, but now, with the introduction of cards like Soul Barrage, suddenly, the amount of cards that now benefit from being discarded had hit such a high number that critical mass was reached, and you'd oftentimes happily discard your entire hand, because by doing so, you'd clear the opponent's board, as well as summoning minions onto your board and throwing a bunch of damage at your opponent's face. The story concludes with what was once a laughable meme, which was discarding your entire hand, now being so good that in order to nerf this card, which they had to do because it broke Wild, they did what would have been considered a buff by basically every other year in Hearthstone history, changing it from discarding your whole hand to just discarding 2 cards. Imagine if that was how the card was printed. Maybe you'd like play it as like a desperation AoE or something for like all of the years it was a laughable meme card riding in your collection. But now, to nerf it, they have to do what many times we would have considered a buff. However, that wasn't even enough, and they were still scared to let the card exist in that state, so they also made it cost 5 mana. That is the story of our first card that flopped in Standard but broke Wild in Cataclysm. Up next, we have Floop's Glorious Gloop, a legendary druid spell from the Boomsday Project set, coming out all the way back in 2018. When it was printed, this was a 1-mana spell that read, whenever a minion dies this turn, gain 1 mana crystal this turn only. What this allowed you to do was combo it with cards that would summon mini attack rushers or other cards that would kill your opponent's minions, and then you'd be able to get the mana back for each minion that you kill, allowing you to more effectively manage your mana while clearing a big board. However, in its time in Standard, the only card you could really combo with it in any sort of like effective way was Poison Seeds. And in Wild, in its time where it broke Wild, that was absolutely something you would do, but having that be the only option meant that this card was never good enough in terms of having the right cards around it to actually see play at all in Standard. However, in later years, sort of in modern Hearthstone, but a couple years ago at this point, they started printing those aforementioned mini rush summon cards, despite Druid's class identity supposed to be that it's weak at having board clears. They just decided, you know what, we're gonna one-up swipe 6 different ways, and we're gonna print cards like Flipper Friends, Scale of Onyxia, or just straight up Raid Boss Onyxia, 3 cards that summon full boards essentially of mini rushers, which in combination with Floop's Glorious Gloop is not only just effective, it's absurdly broken. The way it works is simple. You play Floop's Glorious Gloop, you follow it up with a card such as Poison Seed, Flipper Friends, or Scale of Onyxia. You clear your entire opponent's board by killing off your 2/1 minions and eventually killing off their minions, and you gain more mana than you spent while doing that. So you summon a bunch of things, print a bunch of mana, clear a bunch of stuff, which prints more mana, summon some more things, kill some more things, print some more mana, and you don't just get back up to 10. No, this gives you a mana crystal, so you can go over 10. And if you have Guff, over 20. Not that it really matters your starting mana cost. You can go as high as you manage to create by killing things off and gaining mana. And much like the last card, it reached a point where there was enough reasons to use it. You know, we didn't just have Poison Seeds, you had all these cards. And so every single Druid deck under the sun, just ever, essentially, outside of a few aggro ones, would happily throw Floop's Glorious Gloop and the supporting cards in their deck and just have infinitely powerful swing and removal turns, which just dominated basically everything else you could do for a number of years. It allowed you to clear off boards, print a bunch of mana to OTK in various different ways, as well as just buy you time to OTK in various different ways. We had decks that would use Bran, Old Alex, New Corset Alex to AoE. We'd have decks that would use those and also put in Astalor. You had decks that would be much memeier than that, but would still win because Druid's just general core cards at this point, the kind of cards that were in all versions of Druid decks were just so bonkers, and Gloop's Floopity Gloppity Gloop was at the pinnacle of all of it. This card, as a result of breaking Wild, was eventually nerfed in 2024 to read, whenever a minion dies this turn, refresh a mana crystal. So like I said previously, you could go over however much mana you had and just have an infinite amount of mana. Now you cannot. You have to be a lot more careful with how you use your mana as you're making more mana back, and it's just a lot weaker. And honestly, I don't even think really it's seeing play currently. I'm sure you could, and I'm sure like it's okay in certain situations still, but it's not nearly the powerhouse attention grabber game-winning Death of Destruction that it once was. Up next is Velen, leader of the Exiled. This is a bit of a mouthful, so bear with me, but Velen, the many words on his card, say taunt, death rattle, trigger the battle cries, and death rattles of all other Draenei you played this game. He is also a Draenei himself. A lot of context to explain here. 7 mana, 7/7. Draenei, a new type added to Hearthstone with the Great Dark Beyond set. Fitting for Velen to be it, given that he's the leader of the Draenei people, but we don't need to get into lore. What this card effectively means is that any other Draenei cards in the game, whether new or retroly actively given the tag tribe type of Draenei, when this dies, it triggers the battle cries and death rattles of any of those cards that have previously been played and in the death rattles case have died and then had their death rattles trigger. So we'll take a simple case here, a card like Selfless Hero, for example, a card that is both a wild constructed card as well as a battlegrounds card. But anyway, when it dies as a 1 mana 2/1 and gives a friendly minion Divine Shield, it also is then added to Velen's pool. So when Velen dies, it would trigger the Selfless Hero death rattle and also give a Divine Shield to a random friendly minion, right? So on and so forth. And then something like a battle cry, very simple. When it would die, say maybe your Flame Juggler, which was a card that was retroactively given Draenei. This would die, and then would deal 1 damage to a random enemy as it activates the Flame Juggler battle cry. Sort of simple, right? It's like the new age version of like kind of like a value bomb. It's like a parasitic mechanic that's got like a little bit of support in a certain expansion. We've seen this before with like the souls you shuffle into your deck that when draw and heal you for 2, but could also be destroyed, the soul fragments with the other cards that use it. This is kind of like the big payoff to that type of thing where you put enough Draenei in your deck, and then this card on its own does a lot of different things depending on how you built and played that game. However, while all of that is fun and good and exciting and new, what is important here is its particular interaction with a wild card, Serenite Chain Gang, another card that was retroactively given the Draenei Tribe tag. You see, Serenite Chain Gang, a rare neutral minion from the Knights of the Frozen Throne set that when printed read Battlecry, summon a copy of this minion, which meant that when Velen would die and trigger the Serenite Chain Gang Battlecry, it would summon another copy of Velen. So you're like, okay, infinite 7 mana 7/7, is that really that big of a deal? Well, yes and no, but what's important is we look at the first word of text on this card, Taunt. It is not just an infinite 7 mana 7/7, it is an infinite 7 mana 7/7 with Taunt. So you kill this Draenei, Velen, Taunt, and then it just pops back up. So your board, every minion you play on your board, the stats of those minions are now effectively useless unless you can silence or transform this Velen in some way, creating an infinite Taunt wall in a singular 2-card combo of 2 neutral cards that could be played in any deck that desired to play them.
You can't get past him. He's back! Thank you so much to Evil Hearthstone for creating this deck.
Due to the frustration and ease of access to this combo, many players complained, and as a result, Velen was not changed because Velen's a standard card. You don't change standard cards for Wild, then you shouldn't. Instead, Serenite Chain Gang took the bullet, and Serenite Chain Gang actually got nerfed in a way that it did previously all the way back in 2018, and it now reads Taunt, Battlecry, Summon a Serenite Chain Gang. This is really quite poetic because when this card was added in 2017, it said summon a copy of this minion. It was then nerfed at the end of 2018 to say summon a Serenite Chain Gang. And then 3 years later, when it was rotated back to Wild, it was reverted with the Forged in the Barrens rotation to say summon a copy of this minion. It was then 3 years later given the Draenei tag, and as a result, in 2025, only 3 months ago, it was the nerfed again, back like it was in 2018. What a fitting full circle moment where this card just can't stay out of the targets long enough and is back to being its poor neutered self. But Velen, Leader of the Exiled, as a result, a card on our list for a card that flopped, doing nothing with the few Draenei that are there, but broke Wild. I should be clear, Velen is still standard legal, so it's possible that they are saving potential game-breaking synergies with the card for later on in its lifetime. But as of right now, it is a perfect example of a card that has a clear way of shining in the Wild format, but is sitting around doing nothing in standard. Up next, we have Star Aligner, an epic neutral minion from the Boomsday Project set. 7 mana, 7 attack, 7 health. Battlecry. If you control 3 minions with 7 health, deal 7 damage to all enemies. So basically, if you have 2 other minions that aren't Star Aligner, and they have exactly 7 health, when you play Star Aligner, it will be the third of the minions that are required by its text, and you will deal 7 damage to all enemies, their board, and their face. This is one of those cards that, because it is so cool and so flashy, there are going to be people trying it. So if this video was 5 cards that literally were never played in the history of the universe ever, Star Aligner couldn't be on it, because of course people are going to try to play Star Aligner. It's a neutral card. It's very powerful if you remove its condition, and so if you can make its condition work, a war golem that deals 7 to everything is very cool and very enticing. So people played it in standard, but it was noticeably pictured here a bit of a meme, a bit of copium. And some people in particular loved it enough to just try it in like every imaginable class, but it just was not actually good in any of them. That is until we look over at the Wild format. You see, in Wild, you have a bit more cards available to you to allow you to do some pretty crazy things. And one of those many things you could do was actually consistently enable the condition to be able to make your Star Aligner go off. The way that this was most prevalent was actually one of Wild's most first broken decks, really, really early on in Wild, your best decks were just standard decks that had just rotated, or just straight up standard decks with a few better cards. But once decks got to a point where they were like officially Wild decks, this was one of those that was very, very broken very, very early on, and was very, very like, whoa, if you want to play this, you go to Wild. That's what Wild is now. It's these decks we've never seen before, but are really, really powerful, using all the years finally worth of cards. The deck in question, AK-47 Druid. I didn't name it. What it is Aviana as the A, Kun the Forgotten King as the K, and then 4 7s could kind of be like all the 7s on this text. It could also be Juicy Psych Melon as the 4 and Starliner as the 7, depending on your interpretation of the acronym. But it's essentially referring to Starliner being a gun that just deals 7 to everything, and when you combine it with Bren Bronzebeard, you do it to everything again. And with Aviana Kun, you have 10 mana or more, and all your minions cost 1, so playing something like Medivh to have another minion with 7 health before your Starliner, and then playing all your Starliners and all your brands doesn't really cost you any mana, and your opponent explodes. This was just an absolute powerhouse back in 2018, and it was the deck that finally got Aviana nerfed. A perfect classic example of a card that did nothing in standard, being a fun meme, but absolutely broke Wild. Last but not least, although maybe it is least, who knows, is Lothraxion the Redeemed, a legendary paladin minion from the Madness at the Dark Moon Fair set. 5 mana 5/5 demon for some reason that reads Battle Cry for the rest of the game after you summon a Silverhand recruit. Give it Divine Shield. I'm not surprised it's a demon based on the character and everything that's going on thematically. It's just weird that it's a demon, like in terms of just the playing of these cards. But anyway, this is a card built around dudes in Paladin. Something like a dude Paladin or an odd Paladin. And if you don't know what dude Paladin or dudes means, we're referring to the Silverhand recruits that the hero power summons. For whatever reason in the Hearthstone community, we've shortened Silverhand recruit to dude. I'm a fan of it personally, but if you didn't know, that's why. And Dude Paladin specifically was actually a deck during the Dark Moonfair expansion with the release of Lothraxion. The deck was everywhere. There was like 8 different versions of it. There's tons of YouTube videos of people playing it. And at first I thought I wasn't going to be able to include Lothraxion on this list because he was everywhere. But then I kept looking deeper and I realized all of these Dude Paladin lists are just day 1 through like day 4. And then the deck immediately fell out of favor because people realized that decks like Pure Paladin and Libram Paladin were significantly better, and people needed to stop messing around with the new stuff and find what was actually good. And so if you look on YouTube and you look for Madness at the Dark Moon Fair Dude Paladin, you'll find a lot of videos. But if you go to something like Vicious Syndicate and you look at like what was actually good during those years, you'll see Lothraxion absolutely nowhere. This is one of those cards that kind of doesn't need to be explained too much, right? You've got infused Dude Paladin support cards that came out, and you've got the Dark Moon Fair 3/3 that corrupts into a 5/5. You've got these type of Dude Paladin cards, but much like Cataclysm with the discard mechanic, the Silverhand recruit being the hero power of Paladin, it is an evergreen mechanic that keeps getting sprinkled in, and in Wild, you have a whole lot more of it because you have the entire catalog that's ever been existed to you, including neutral card, Baku the Moon Eater, allowing you to play this in Odd Paladin. This is one of the cards that I think on this list, quote unquote, broke Wild the least, because do you say this card broke Wild? Do you say Baku was just really good in Wild still with Odd Paladin? Do you claim Muster? Or really, is it just all of it? And this is just kind of one of the legendaries in it that's kind of like loud and screaming and being like, hey, look at me. But regardless, this is kind of representative of all of those cards hitting a critical mass where none of them really saw play in standard. Like there was absolutely Dude Paladin in Nathria, and there's been absolutely Dude Paladin cards sprinkled throughout that have seen play. But in terms of like an entire deck, Lothraxion just didn't have it the way that others did. But in Wild, you had absolutely a powerhouse where you're just flooding the board with dudes, threatening lethal basically at every turn because you can just buff them with a million different cards. And so now giving them Divine Shield means it is so much harder for your opponent to deal with these dudes consistently to stop themselves from dying to them. Instead of just kind of getting removed by your opponent's AoE and kind of just falling out of the game because you're kind of an aggro deck, you now have an additional power level on your late game boards that allows the deck to continue going in the late game. We see this type of thing today with the Murloc Paladin quest that was added in the new Ungoro set. Yes, there's a new Ungoro, but we don't have to get into that too much. Where essentially the quest is just play Murlocs, And then the buff, the reward is a buff to your cards in your Murlocs when you play them, but that buff keeps going up because the quest is repeatable. And so it makes it so that instead of kind of just like running out of not only like cards, but also steam because your minions fall off, you're now continually buffing your boards that you summon higher and higher as the game goes on. So they kind of adjust with the power level of the later turns, allowing your deck to have some actual staying power later in the game. Instead of just playing 2 mana 2/3 still, you're now playing like a 2 mana 8/9 or something because you got a big buff. This similar effect happened with Lothraxion because your dudes now had Divine Shield in the later game, and so they weren't just 1/1s that could easily be ignored or killed, because you had to have 2 sources of damage to be able to deal with them, and that allowed a lot more counterplay and allowed the deck to have staying power for a lot longer, which allowed it to stay on top of the wild meta for a lot longer, leading to a lot of frustrations as the deck and card broke wild. That is our 5th and final card that flopped in standard but broke wild. There were a lot more cards that could have been on this list that weren't, but these are 5 of them that I thought were flashy and I thought were great, good examples, especially cards like Cataclysm or the interaction with the new Velen card. These are things that are only possible in Wild, and whether you like it or not, it is one of the main cool things that the Wild mode offers to you. So that is why I have chosen these cards for this list. But if you have favorite options that weren't on here and you want me to do this again, feel free to comment about them in the comments down below. And if you made it this far, you really should be subscribed if you're not already, because I don't ask and plug it 2 seconds in like other YouTubers. I just wait to the end. But if you're making it to the end of my videos, you actually like them, so you should be subscribed. And if you enjoyed this video and want to keep watching, click this video here in the middle of the screen where I talk about Hearthstone. Can you believe that? I talked about Hearthstone. Crazy.